to the Epistle to Titus. And you may notice that last week we covered the book of 1 Timothy, and tonight we have Titus, and then next week we'll conclude this particular study with the second letter to Timothy. I would like to recommend to you a resource, if you don't already have it. Brother Wayne Jackson's book entitled Before I Die is a very good and accessible commentary on 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. And he has a lot of good information, not only on the text and the proper translation of the Greek into the English, but he's also got some very useful information in the introductory sections to each book. I don't know if you read the introductions and commentaries to books, or if you go straight to the part that begins with chapter 1, verse 1. But let me encourage you to read the introductions, because there's a lot of very valuable information in that introduction section that will tell you a lot about the history and the geography and the culture and the background of both the recipients of the epistles, in the cases of epistles, and also about the circumstances of the writer, as far as we know them, when that particular book or letter was written. And also, to the extent that we're able to know those things, what occasioned the writing of a certain letter or book, to bring it all kind of into bird's eye view before you begin diving deeply into the text. And so Brother Jackson's book, Before I Die, I wish David Boggs isn't in here, is he? He could tell you if they have it in stock at Christian Courier or not, but I would recommend you ask David if you want a copy of this. All right, so we begin to talk about the letter to Titus, and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are often lumped together into a group that is frequently by commentators styled the pastoral epistles. And a lot of the reason they call it that is because of a denominational point of view in which they view it as Paul, as a high pastor, writing to a lower ranking pastor, specifically Timothy and Titus, who would then be the pastor over the congregation they were working with. Absolutely nothing could be farther from the truth, and if you want a text to prove that, 1 Timothy and Titus is as good as I can think of, because they tell us how the church is to be organized in terms of leadership, and it was never with a single pastor, but with a group of them, elders. And both 1 Timothy and Titus give qualifications for elders, and so to call these the pastoral epistles is really a misnomer, unless you are referring to the fact that they specifically give us qualifications for the pastors of the church, who are the elders. But that'd be sort of picking on one particular section to the exclusion of others. So I prefer just to refer to them as 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and leave it at that. As you know, Timothy was a very close confederate of Paul's in his work, but so was Titus. And Titus is mentioned quite a bit throughout Paul's epistles, although interestingly enough, he's never mentioned in any of Luke's writings. So the book of Acts never mentions Titus. It mentions Timothy quite a bit, but never Titus. Don't know if that's because Luke potentially may have had some relationship with Titus. Some have suggested that maybe Titus was Luke's brother, and out of modesty, Luke simply didn't mention him, just as Luke never mentions himself, except in the most obtuse way when he uses the first-person pronouns occasionally. We did this and we did that, that by implication includes Luke. Don't know why Luke doesn't mention Titus. Could be that Paul didn't meet Titus until after the book of Acts ends, at the beginning of Paul's first Roman imprisonment. I tend to think that's unlikely, especially in light of something Paul wrote about the fact that he took Titus to Jerusalem, and I believe that the reference he's making there is to that last trip to Jerusalem where the riot ensued that got him jailed, that ended up with him going to Rome the first time. I believe that Titus was with him on that trip, although I couldn't prove it by Luke's writings. Okay? But at any rate, Titus is one of Paul's proteges, you might say. And Titus has, as best we can tell, a different personality than Timothy. Let me see if I can illustrate this. There are some people whose personality and demeanor is simply better suited for a difficult, a very fiery type situation where feelings are inflamed and controversy arises. There are some people who can walk into a situation like that with back straight and shoulders squared, and it doesn't shake them up. There are other people who are quite put off by controversy, or who struggle in a situation like that to command respect, especially among people who don't agree with them. And there are some people who just walk into the room and everybody kind of hushes and listens to what they have to say. Let me see if I can illustrate this to you. Let's say that you were in the midst of doing something you shouldn't do. Would you rather, in the midst of doing something you shouldn't do, be reprimanded by Doug Hayes or Sean Jones? Now, I love both of them, but they would take very different approaches, wouldn't they? Doug is as kind and gentle a person as you have ever met. And he would never back away from telling you what you needed to hear, but at the same time, he would tell it to you, and it would almost feel like a compliment coming from him in a way. Doug is just so gentle and kind in his personality. Sean would say, "Now, what do you think you're doing?" And he'd just stare at you. And I hope Sean's watching this, because he knows he would. If he were here, I'd be looking at him right now. And he'd just stare at you till you fessed up to what you had done. There are just some folks like that who have a personality that can go into a high conflict situation and be firm and be authoritative in that. And Titus seems to have been such a person. In fact, Paul sent him at least twice to Corinth. When Corinth was essentially in the midst of an uproar, and maybe you might even say a mutiny against Paul, at least some of them. And Titus goes in there, and after dealing with the church at Corinth, when he comes back and reports to Paul, Paul is overjoyed at the change that has taken place in the Corinthian church. It seems like Titus had the ability to sort of knock heads if he had to. And so when we are introduced to Titus in this epistle, Paul mentions that he sent him or left him in Crete. And he makes it very clear in the first chapter that he put him in a high conflict situation. There were some things that needed to be corrected, and there were some people, to use Paul's words, whose mouths had to be stopped and who had to be stood up to because of false doctrine that they were teaching. And Titus was the one that he left in charge of doing that. And so Titus seems to be a man who has a strong, authoritative type personality, and Paul could count on him for those type situations. Well, when we think about where Titus was, he's on the island of Crete. If you notice in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, this is a map of the island of Crete. I should have given you a bigger map that showed some of the surrounding area, but it's down below Asia Minor in the Mediterranean Sea. And the island of Crete has a history that goes way, way, way back. The Cretan people, Minoan people, predate some of the Greek settlements that we know of. But by Paul's time, it was largely heavily influenced by the Greek culture, but very much under the control of the Roman Empire. In fact, it came under Roman dominion in 69 BCE, and it remained under Roman dominion at the time Paul wrote this letter. But very heavily influenced by Greek culture and Greek religion, but also there was a very distinctive Cretan culture. Now, I mentioned on the slide the Epimenides paradox. Paul quotes something that is found in other writings from antiquity and attributed to a Cretan authority whose name was Epimenides. And Epimenides said, among other things, all Cretans are liars. Now, the reason they call this a paradox is because Epimenides was a liar. Think about that for a moment. If all Cretans are liars, and Epimenides is a Cretan, by Socratic logic, what? Epimenides is a liar. So that raises the question, is Epimenides lying when he says all Cretans are liars? In which case that raises the possibility that at least some Cretans are truth tellers, which proves false Epimenides' statement that all Cretans, you see where I'm going with this? It's a paradox. You can go round and round and round with this. But Paul mentions this in his description of the work into which he has put Titus. And he says not only do the Cretans' own prophet say that they are all liars, he goes on and adds something else to it. They are liars, they are evil beasts, and they are lazy gluttons, or to use the King James term that I really enjoy there, they are slow bellies. I like that. That's picturesque, isn't it? Slow bellies. But essentially he's saying what? They're a culture that is steeped in being untrustworthy, undependable, lazy, and contrary to that which is good. Now, if this letter has a theme, the theme is going to be the relationship between sound doctrine and good works. Now, if you take a culture that is characterized by being liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons, who in the world needs sound doctrine and good works more than people like that? They need to learn to do good works and follow sound doctrine, right? But that's going to be an uphill climb. It's going to be a difficult battle. And so Paul is sending Titus into this environment to try and teach them sound doctrine, which will bring about good works. Now, that relationship has not always been appreciated in religious circles. In fact, there are quite a few who would like to separate the idea of good works and sound doctrine from one another, and especially in the sense that they would like to say you don't need sound doctrine to do good works. Paul's letters would say otherwise. Paul's letters would say sound doctrine begets good works and teaches us how to do good works. But now, whenever you hear someone belittling or rejecting the idea of doctrine or sound doctrine, let that be a red flag to you. Because what that should indicate to you is that something in the teaching that they are rejecting is something they don't want to obey. Doctrine just means teaching. So if someone is teaching me to do good works, and I reject that teaching, what can you conclude? Some part of the good works that they're trying to teach me, I don't want to do. And it may be any of a number of things, but that tends to be the case. When people want to glamorize one particular subset of good works and then reject doctrine, especially if they use the word doctrine and say, these people are hung up on doctrine, and make it sound like doctrine is a dirty word, and love and kindness is what they're all about. If you look very closely, a lot of times you'll find that some of the good works that are taught in the doctrine are things that they don't want to be bound to do. And they're trying to paint a rosy picture over here to distract from the thing that they don't want to follow. And that was probably the case in Crete. So Paul sends Titus into this situation. Let's think about some elements of this book, because Paul immediately in chapter 1 launches into talking about the qualifications of elders. Now, he has done that also in 1 Timothy. And here again, he reiterates the qualifications of elders. I understand, and you should understand as well, that those two lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, if you line them up, do not match identically to one another. They should be read in the same way that you would read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are not identical, but rather supplementary to one another. Matthew tells us some things that Mark doesn't. Mark tells us some things that Luke doesn't. Luke tells us some things that John doesn't, and John tells us some things that none of the others tell us. Each of them supplement the others, and that's how the qualifications of elders should be read, as supplementary to one another. But the purpose in giving these qualifications is that Paul is saying to Titus, you need to go through the churches in Crete and appoint elders. For what purpose? They're going to be the ones who are primarily responsible for ensuring that the doctrine, the teaching that goes on in the churches, is sound doctrine, that it's not corrupted by false teaching. And it's going to be their responsibility to confront those who would pervert the teaching of sound doctrine. And it's also going to be their duty to ensure that the good works that the sound doctrine teaches are being done by the church. And so they're going to be the ones who are leading. Now, if that is the model for the leadership of the church, what room does that leave for Bishop Titus to be over the church? It doesn't, does it? Nor will you ever see Titus referred to as a bishop anywhere in Scripture. That doesn't come about until about the 3rd or 4th century, when people looking back after already having corrupted the structure of the church into a hierarchical system of authority want to look back and paint onto the history of the church a gloss that fits with the doctrine they've developed, not the doctrine that came from the pen of the inspired writers. And so they began to talk about Timothy being the bishop of Ephesus. I'll get it out in a second. Titus being the bishop of Crete, and so on and so forth, when Scripture knows nothing of the sort. Instead, those men were instructed to appoint elders. All right. Next, he talks about the role of elderly Christians. For the sake of brevity, I just put the role of elderly Christians on the slide, but it's the role of elderly Christians in relation to relatively younger Christians. And it's the idea that the elderly Christians are to teach the younger Christians how to be good husbands, how to be good fathers, how to be good men in the church, how to be good wives, how to be good mothers, how to be good women in the church, and so on and so forth. And so there's to be a mentoring and a modeling by the elder members toward the younger members. Then he moves on in the latter part of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3 and talks about principles of godliness, these good works that sound doctrine teaches us to observe, and the principles that underlie them. Now, this book is relatively brief, and so Paul doesn't go into great detail on these things. Rather, he paints a picture of the overarching principles that when those principles are applied, they will have application in a number of specific situations that will lead the Christian to live out his life. So he doesn't, for example, go into detail the way he does in the Colossian and Ephesian letters and say, all right, now husbands, you do this. Wives, you do that. Children, you do this. Servants, you do this. Masters, you do that. He doesn't go into that kind of particular detail. He deals more in principle here. All right, now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the biggest issue that you're going to run into when you begin reading these introduction sections that I've encouraged you to read, especially when you read from the pens of what we might call liberal scholars. They are going to, very many of them, loudly say that the so-called pastoral epistles were not written by Paul. And they will primarily cite two reasons why they believe that Paul couldn't have written 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. One is the level of organization in the church, they say, is anachronistic. In other words, you're trying to put into Paul's time a level of organization in the church that didn't develop until much later. Well, if you're going to say that, then you're also going to have a problem with Luke, because Luke said that after the first missionary journey, Paul went back through the cities where he had preached the gospel and appointed elders in every church. Now, what does he tell Timothy to do? Appoint elders. What does he tell Titus to do? Appoint elders. Now, he adds deacons, but Luke also most likely talks about the appointing of deacons. The reason I say most likely is that specific word is not used in Acts chapter 6. But the work that is described for those men who were appointed, those 7 men in the church of Jerusalem, is very much the type of work that you would expect to be characteristic of deacons. And it's my judgment that those 7 men in Acts 6 were the first deacons. And so you have Luke talking about most likely deacons and elders in the church some 10 years or more before Paul would have written this epistle. Okay? Furthermore, and here's the issue I really have with this. Where did the church start geographically? Where did it start? Jerusalem. Right in the heart of Judaism, right? And not only that, it started in a time in which every little town where the Jews lived, with very few exceptions, had a synagogue. As a matter of fact, this was not only characteristic of Palestine, where the concentration of the Jews was the highest, but it was so much the case that in the vast majority of places that Paul visited on his missionary journeys, the first place he went to preach the gospel was in the synagogues in those cities. The one notable exception we noticed was Philippi, that didn't seem to have a synagogue. But in most cities, even Corinth had a synagogue, and Paul preached there. Wherever you found Jews in high concentration, you found synagogues. Guess what every synagogue had? Elders. And had for a couple of centuries. Every synagogue had elders who were responsible for shepherding that particular synagogue, which functioned very much like a congregation. Folks, it is not such a huge historical departure to suggest that a church that began right in the heart of Judaism, composed primarily of Jews, in fact, solely of Jews, until Cornelius' household in Acts chapter 10, which is some years after the establishment of the church, would have had the concept of elders in every congregation because they grew up with it. Every synagogue had elders. And so that was not a foreign or new concept to the church at all. And so when the gospel begins to spread, you take a man like Paul, who describes himself as a Hebrew of the Hebrews, right? Who sat at the feet of Gamaliel, who is steeped up to his eyeballs in Judaism as far as his background and culture. How natural would it have been? And I'm just saying, if we assume that the Holy Spirit hadn't guided him to do this, if Paul was left to his own devices, how natural would it have been for him to have organized the congregations of the Lord's church that he began something along the model of the synagogues that he was used to growing up? Isn't that how we typically function? We draw off of what we know. And so then when Paul begins to write, and he's writing to Timothy and he's writing to Titus to establish elders, and we see that he did that in Luke's account, well, that's no shock at all. In fact, the nation of Israel had elders way back at the time of Moses. So this is not a new thing, and the scholars who try to suggest that the church developing elders was some sort of a brand new development, they're way out in left field, historically speaking. All right? Now, secondly, they will harp on differences of style and vocabulary. Now, we're going to quantify that here in just a moment. But let me preface that by saying this. Do you notice, those of you who have been in this class for a while, do you notice a difference in tone and terminology when I teach this class versus the times when I preach in the auditorium? I hope you do. My audience is different. I deal with you differently than I do when we've got everything from cradle roll to 1 foot in the grave. Pardon that reference. and all levels of Christian development. I probably could have said that better. I'm sorry. But you get the point I'm making. We have all levels of Christian development in our General Assembly, and the way I approach a matter in that setting is going to be very different from the way I approach it in a class that's primarily made up of folks who've been a Christian a good long while and have been eating that meat that Luke referred to in his lesson tonight. Okay? Because you're ready for more developed thoughts. That's level one. Level two. The closest friends that you have. Could you honestly say, your friends and your closest family, could you honestly say that you could almost hold a conversation with those people in the company of strangers, and the strangers wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about? You almost have a code language with those people, don't you? References to things that only you and they know about, inside jokes, words that have taken on special meaning in that particular camaraderie, things of that nature, so that when you talk to them, your vocabulary is quite different than if you were making a general address to a broad group of people. Of course you do. Stan's grinning because we've got a group that is absolutely that way. I mean, it's code word after code word, isn't it? These are two of Paul's closest compatriots. It's absolutely to be expected that Paul would write to them differently than he would write his other epistles that are addressed almost without exception, the one exception being Philemon, to churches, which are made up of some people he knows quite well and is close to, other people he doesn't know as well, and most likely some folks who've been converted since the last time he's been to that church, and so he's trying to address his words as broadly as he possibly can. Whereas when he's writing a letter to a single person with whom he's shared years of ministry, there are a lot of things he can say in an intimate manner that he'd never say writing to a broader group. It's just natural mode of human communication. So to say that the vocabulary and style of Paul writing to Timothy and Titus is vastly different, well, of course it is. They're some of his best friends. Now, let's quantify that just a little bit, because they really harp on this point, and they go to some really silly lengths, in my opinion, to try and make the case. I got to loosen both sides, don't I? I'm going to throw a Latin word at you here. Don't ride me out of town on a rail. Hapax legomena is a Latin word that means essentially a word that doesn't appear anywhere else. Okay? In every book in the New Testament, there are some words in that book that don't occur anywhere else in the New Testament. That's true in every piece of literature. You know, in every work that Shakespeare wrote, there are some words in that particular work that don't appear in any of his other works, so on and so forth. Okay, that's just natural. The argument is that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are so drastically more concentrated in hapax legomena than all of other books that Paul wrote, that it necessitates the conclusion that someone else wrote them. So I've done a little bit of numerical work here. First of all, beside each of the names of these books, the first number you see in red is the number of hapax legomena that exist in that book in the original Greek. Okay, so for Philemon, there are a grand total of 5. That's a one-page book. However, in Romans, there are 113 of them. Okay? Now, that raw number is not so very meaningful, and I heard the bell, by the way. You have to compare it with the overall length of the book. Some writers have done that and said, well, the way we ought to quantify this is we ought to take that book as it's printed in an ordinary Bible and quantify how many hapax legomena per page. How many of you have the same number of words on a page in your Bible as the person sitting next to you? Okay. Secondly, how many of you are toting around a Greek Testament? Not you, Matthew. You probably have one. besides Matthew and me. We don't. That's a silly way to quantify. But I read one author who went through and did that, and these blue numbers are his. He said Romans had 4.3 hapax legomena per page, and 1 Timothy had 13 per page. Do you see the problem with the variables that's introduced? Let's take this a little more scientifically, shall we? What if we noted the ratio of hapax legomena in a given book to the total number of words in that same book? In other words, we take 113 hapax legomena in Romans, we divide the total number of words in Romans by 113, and we come up with the ratio, which is you have one unusual word for every 62.9 words in the book. All right? So the lower the ratio, obviously, the higher the density of hapax legomena in that book. And sure enough, 1 and 2 Timothy do have the highest concentration of hapax legomena in anything that Paul wrote. Guess what? Something had to have the highest concentration. Just so happens it's 1 and 2 Timothy. But now look at Titus. It's 1 in 50.7 words. That's closer, 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians has a higher concentration than Titus. So if you're going to make that argument, don't throw Titus into that argument, because Titus disproves the rule, right? If the argument means anything, it only applies to 1 and 2 Timothy. But now, let's just say, and I think we can say without any danger, Paul used a whole lot more words that were unusual in 1 and 2 Timothy especially. What does that prove? It proves that Paul used more unusual words in 1 and 2 Timothy and nothing else. That's it. Doesn't prove he didn't write it. Doesn't prove it wasn't inspired. It might prove that he was really, really close to Timothy, and there were some things he could say to Timothy that he wouldn't say to anybody else. Food for thought. Thank you so much for your attention.